imagine, if you will, that you are tasked with building a thriving, like globally dominant civilization.
Okay, a big task.
Right, a massive task. But there is a huge catch. You are not allowed to build it in a lush, warm river valley.
So no Fertile Crescent.
Exactly. You don't get the Fertile Crescent. You don't get, this sunny, highly predictable Mediterranean coast where wheat just, well, where it practically grows itself.
Yeah, the easy mode of history.
Right. Instead, you have to build your civilization on frozen coastlines, dense, impenetrable boreal forests, and these isolated, jagged fjords.
It sounds miserable, honestly.
It does. You are quite literally on the harsh peripheral edge of the habitable world. I mean, it sounds like an impossible urban planning challenge.
Yeah, a complete recipe for historical obscurity.
Exactly. Yet this frozen, jagged edge of the map, it didn't just survive. It actually built the blueprint for modern global networking.
It is a phenomenal paradox,
Yeah.
really.
It is, and that is exactly what we are getting into today. Welcome to the deep dive. We are looking at a trajectory that spans from, well, the retreat of the Ice Age glaciers all the way to the modern Nordic welfare states.
Tracing that massive arc of Scandinavia, Finland, Iceland, and the Baltic region.
Yes. And the mission for this deep dive, we've got a huge stack of historical and sociological notes here. We are trying to figure out how a harsh peripheral edge of the world transformed into a globally dominant networked center.
And, to make sense of all of the sources we have today, we really have to establish the core thesis that underpins this entire region's history.
Right.
The sources argue that Northern Europe is best understood, fundamentally, through the lens of a maritime frontier.
A maritime frontier.
Exactly. It's a region defined by mobility under, well, intense physical constraint. What you have to realize for this deep dive is that in this part of the world, the sea connected far more than the land ever separated.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to really get the psychology of this maritime frontier, we have to start with the physical reality of the dirt, or really the lack of it.
Yeah, the dirt is pretty terrible.
It is. The geographic foundations of this region are wild. You're looking at a landscape dominated by endless coastlines, waterlogged peatlands, massive glacial lakes, and, actual Arctic tundra.
Right. And that geography physically prevented the formation of those centralized Mediterranean-style civilizations that we are so used to studying in standard history classes.
Yeah. Let's look at the mechanics of why that is, because it's fascinating.
Sure. So if you look at the Roman Empire or ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, what do you see? You see power centralized around a massive agricultural core.
Right, wheat fields.
Exactly. The Roman logistics machine was built on vast plains of wheat in places like North Africa and Sicily. You grow massive surpluses of grain, you tax it, you store it in a central city, and then, you use it to feed a standing professional army.
And then that army controls the land. It's a very straightforward top-down empire-building model. Centralize the food, centralize the power.
Right. But in Northern Europe, the Earth absolutely refused to allow that model. It just wouldn't work.
Because of the soil.
Mostly, yeah. You have the podzol soils of the boreal forest. They are highly acidic, very nutrient-poor, and just terrible for large-scale wheat farming. And then you have the dense taiga, which is essentially an endless, impenetrable wall of pine and spruce.
So you literally can't march an army through it.
No, you can't. Now, the Atlantic Ocean did moderate the climate on the western coasts, thanks to the Gulf Stream, making them milder than their extreme latitude would suggest.
Right, so it wasn't all just frozen wasteland.
Right, but the inland and Arctic areas remained brutal. You simply couldn't throw seeds in the ground, build a massive centralized megacity, and then march legions across the landscape.
So how do you even settle a place like that if you're one of the early people there?
Well, the sources show that settlements had to cling to the edges. They clustered along the shorelines, nestled deep into the fjords, and dotted the navigable river mouths.
They were just looking for any tiny pocket of livable land.
Exactly. They had to find those tiny pockets in the southern farming belts, where the soil was just forgiving enough to grow hardy crops like rye and barley.
Which means their diet, and by extension their entire daily economy, completely reflected that constraint. You couldn't rely on pure, sweeping agriculture.
No, you had to turn to the water.
Right. The sources detail food systems that relied heavily on catching cod and herring, hunting marine mammals like seals and walruses, and eventually managing tough, cold-weather livestock for dairy.
It's important to note, too, that it wasn't one monolithic northern way of life. It was a spectrum.
Oh, absolutely.
You had maritime communities on the Norwegian coast, agrarian pockets in Denmark, and Arctic pastoral survival in the far north. You survived based on exactly what your specific, tiny slice of geography allowed.
And this brings us to the profound psychological and really the political impact of that environment. Because the environment was so harsh and the resources were so dispersed, power itself had to be distributed.
Yes. Think about the logistics of enforcement.
Right.
You couldn't have one supreme divine emperor sitting in a palace dictating the daily lives of people scattered across hundreds of isolated islands and dense forests.
It just wouldn't work. Like if a king tried to send tax collectors overland through a frozen bog in the middle of winter, they just wouldn't make
You
it.
freeze or get lost.
It's like building an early internet, relying entirely on decentralized edge nodes rather than a single massive server.
That's a really good analogy.
Thanks. I mean, they didn't have a centralized hub to route all the traffic and power through, so they built an incredibly robust network of edges. And there is an amazing geographic paradox here that the sources highlight,
It is.
that they were incredibly remote from the older Mediterranean imperial cores like Rome or Constantinople, but they were deeply, intensely connected internally.
Yes. The Baltic Sea and the North Sea became these massive, frictionless maritime highways.
Right.
What's fascinating here is how this very paradox, this decentralized watery isolation, actually forced them to look outward.
Because they had to.
Exactly. The forest was a wall, but the sea was a road. Because you couldn't rely on a massive, easy agricultural surplus at home to generate wealth, you had to find resources elsewhere.
So they learned to sail.
They did. The sea taught them how to navigate, not just physically, but economically and culturally. They mapped out these complex river routes that pushed deep into the continent.
Like the Volga and the Dnieper rivers, right?
Yes, exactly. They used those rivers to link this seemingly isolated northern fringe directly to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphates.
That is just wild to think about.
It is. They were geographically peripheral, yes, but they turned that periphery into a bridge. They became the middlemen of the medieval world.
It's incredible to visualize, for you listening. You have people surviving by hunting seals on a frozen, jagged coast who are simultaneously figuring out how to portage boats down a Russian river network to trade furs and amber for Arabic silver and Byzantine silk.
It's a huge contrast.
It is. But navigating and surviving in this decentralized, watery world was not easy. It required deep, specialized knowledge. Which leads us to ask, well, who actually managed to figure this out first?
Right. How did they adapt to this extreme environment?
Yeah. So to understand the people, we have to look at the very first human footprints in the region.
And according to the ancient DNA sequencing and the archaeological data in our sources, human beings began entering this region roughly 9,000 years ago.
9,000, wow.
Yeah, and they were quite literally chasing the melting ice sheets.
The end of the last ice age.
Exactly. For tens of thousands of years, Scandinavia was buried under a massive continental ice sheet. It was miles thick in places.
I can't even fathom miles of ice.
It's heavy. And as the climate warmed and the ice retreated, that immense weight was lifted, and the land itself began to rebound and rise out of the sea.
That's called post-glacial rebound.
Yes, which is actually still happening today in parts of the Baltic. It's wild. But as the ice melted, it left behind bare rock, which slowly gave way to tundra and then eventually forests.
And humans followed the returning game, like reindeer and elk.
And the incredibly rich marine life that flourished in the cold coastal waters, too.
But, and this is key, it wasn't just one monolithic tribe of cavemen wandering north together.
No, not at all.
The genetic data from the sources identifies multiple highly distinct streams of post-glacial hunter-gatherers converging on this newly exposed land.
It was a massive convergence. You have two primary initial streams. First, there are the Western hunter-gatherers, or WHG.
Okay.
These were populations moving up from continental Europe, traversing areas like Doggerland.
Oh, Doggerland. That was the massive land bridge that used to connect Britain to mainland Europe, right? Before rising sea levels drowned it.
That's the one. These WHG groups were adapted to the expanding temperate forests.
Okay. And the second group?
The Eastern Hunter-Gatherers, or EHG. They arrived from the northeast, moving across the vast expanses of Eurasia and migrating along the ice-free corridors of the northern Norwegian coast.
So they came from completely different directions.
Exactly. These two streams, the Western and the Eastern, eventually met, interacted, and intermingled in Scandinavia.
And then, thousands of years later, agriculture begins to creep into the picture. But what I find fascinating from reading this is that farming didn't just sweep through and instantly replace the old way of life.
Like it did in Southern Europe.
Right. The climate up north was just too unpredictable. So instead, you get this fascinating dynamic called a dual mode world.
That dual mode is a crucial sociological concept for this region. In the southern, more forgiving areas like modern-day Denmark and the southern Swedish plains, farming took hold.
Okay, so they were farming down there.
Yeah. You had groups like the funnelbeaker culture, clearing land, planting grain, and raising cattle. But just a few miles further north, or right along the rocky coasts, agriculture was basically a death sentence.
Because one bad frost meant starvation?
Exactly. So in those areas, foraging, deep-sea fishing, and seal hunting remained highly inactive and completely dominant.
You literally had Neolithic farmers living just a few days' walk from ancient hunter-gatherers. That is so bizarre to picture.
Precisely. You had southern farmers and northern foragers overlapping, interacting, and existing simultaneously for very long stretches of time.
Did they fight?
They traded with each other. They occasionally clashed.
Mm-hmm.
It was not a sudden, clean replacement of a primitive lifestyle by an advanced one. It was a true mosaic of survival strategies.
And we also have to highlight the deep ancestry of the Sámi people here, because when we talk about adaptation to the extreme north, I mean, they are the absolute masters of it. The sources point out that the Sámi are an indigenous people across Sápmi, which is a massive cultural region spanning northern Norway, Sweden, Finland, and the Kola Peninsula in Russia.
Right.
Their history and continuous presence in the region spans thousands of years. It predates any of the modern Scandinavian nation-states.
Yes, the Sámi evolved through deep, long-term adaptation to those extreme northern ecologies. They developed incredibly sophisticated methods for surviving the Arctic, transitioning over time from broad-spectrum hunting and gathering to the specialized reindeer pastoralism that many people associate with them today.
It's pure survival innovation.
It really is. The continuous presence of the Sámi, interacting alongside the varying streams of migrating hunter-gatherers, early farmers, and later Bronze Age populations linked to the Eurasian steppe, well, it points to a very complex demographic reality.
Wait, I have to push back here, or at least clarify something for you listening, because if you consume any modern pop culture movies, fantasy novels, video games, there's this incredibly pervasive myth out there.
Oh, I know the one you mean.
Yeah, this myth of a pure, homogeneous, ancient Northern European bloodline. This idea of an isolated, untouched, singular race of blonde Northern warriors who just sort of emerged directly from the ice.
Right.
But based on the genetic and archaeological data you're describing from the sources, that is a total myth, right? The region was always a product of repeated migration and cultural layering.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you are absolutely right. That concept of a static, pure, ancient bloodline is completely ahistorical.
It's made up.
It is an ideological invention of the 19th and 20th centuries. Identity in Northern Europe was never static. It was always a continuous negotiation and a constant churn.
How so? Walk me through the layers, just to be clear.
Well, you start with the descendants of the original Western and Eastern foragers. Then, early farmers migrate in from Anatolia and the Sound, mixing with the foragers.
Right, the dual mode world.
Exactly. Then a few millennia later, you have massive migrations of pastoralist groups from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, bringing new Indo-European languages and bronze technologies.
So even more mixing.
Yes. Over time, these interacting groups coalesced into the linguistic and cultural families we recognize later. The Finnic peoples in the east, the Baltic peoples, and the North Germanic or Norse speakers in Scandinavia.
It's a huge melting pot.
Sometimes they traded and intermarried. Sometimes an incoming group became the dominant elite and shifted the local language. And sometimes agricultural expansion drove certain groups, like the Sámi, into more marginal northern spaces.
But the core truth is that beneath every people in this region lies deep mixture, adaptation, and reinvention.
Exactly.
That is such a vital reframing. It wasn't a timeless, monolithic tribe marching in a straight line toward becoming a modern nation. It was a complex, turbulent laboratory of survival.
A great way to put it.
But okay, so we have established the playing field. We know the geography is harsh, decentralized, and waterbound. And we know who these people were, layered, deeply adaptable populations who mastered the sea because the land wouldn't feed them. Let's talk about what happened when they fully leveraged that maritime mastery and just exploded outward onto the world stage. We have to talk about the Viking Age.
We do. The Viking Age, which historians generally date from the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 CE to the Battle of Hastings in 1066 CE.
It's arguably the most famous period of Northern European history.
Oh, without a doubt. But it is also, without a doubt, the most wildly misunderstood.
The geographic scope alone is staggering. I mean, they didn't just pop over to England.
No, the Norse expansion was truly breathtaking. We are talking about a maritime reach that extended westward across the open Atlantic to settle Iceland, establish colonies in Greenland, and even build outposts on the shores of North America.
Centuries before Columbus.
Exactly. And simultaneously, they pushed eastward, navigating the shallow, treacherous river systems of Eastern Europe to establish principalities in Novgorod and Kiev, and sailing all the way down the Black Sea to trade with and occasionally attack Constantinople.
But despite that incredible reach, pop culture has completely flattened them into these mindlessly violent barbarians.
Just guys with huge axes, screaming and burning villages.
Right, just because it was their quote-unquote culture. But the reality that the sources stress is that they were master traders, settlers, highly skilled shipbuilders, and incredibly calculating political entrepreneurs.
They weren't just raiders.
Exactly. They weren't expanding just for the thrill of violence. They expanded because they had the technological means, the ships, the trade incentives, and the political opportunity to make seaborne expansion incredibly profitable.
And to illustrate that sheer economic sophistication, we just have to look at the trading hub of Birka.
Oh yeah, Birka.
Birka was located on an island in Lake Mälaren in Sweden. Now, a pop culture view would picture Birka as a muddy pirate cove full of stolen loot.
Skulls on spikes, that sort of thing.
Right. But the archaeology reveals something entirely different. Birka was a highly complex, planned urban node connected to vast global trade routes.
What kind of things were they digging up there?
Archaeologists have found an astonishing circulation of global wealth there. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of Arabic silver dirhams minted in places like Baghdad and Samarkand.
Wow, in Sweden.
Yes. They found Byzantine silks, glass beads from the Mediterranean, and even a bronze Buddha statue from northern India.
A Buddha statue in a Viking town.
Yeah. In exchange, the Norse were funneling northern commodities southward: walrus ivory, furs, amber, and brutally human captives.
Right, the slave trade. We can't gloss over that.
No, we can't. The Viking economy was heavily reliant on the taking and selling of slaves or thralls. They captured people from the British Isles, Slavic lands, and the Baltics, and sold them down the river networks to the Byzantine and Islamic worlds.
Where demand for enslaved labor was incredibly high.
Yes, this proves that Northern Europe during the Viking Age wasn't a barbaric backwater. They were a ruthless, highly efficient global broker. They were the connective tissue between disparate, wealthy empires.
And just to set the visual record straight for you listening, we have to officially debunk the horned helmet.
Oh, please do.
I know it's a staple of every Halloween costume and sports mascot, but archaeologists do not treat horned helmets as standard Viking gear. The sources clarify it as a much later 19th century romanticized fantasy.
Popularized largely by Wagnerian operas.
Exactly. What they actually wore in combat was highly practical for maritime travel: iron skull caps, chainmail if they were rich, and thick padded clothing.
Practicality was their religion, and that absolute dedication to practical utility is the key to understanding their military strategy.
And here's where it gets really interesting. When you analyze their expansion, the Vikings were essentially early, heavily armed venture capitalists.
I love that comparison.
Think about it. Look at how the Romans fought. The Romans engaged in systematic territorial annihilation. They would march a massive army inland, build paved roads, build aqueducts, subjugate the entire local population, and hold the territory with massive stone forts.
And permanent garrisons?
Right. It was incredibly capital intensive.
It required a massive, continuous influx of grain and taxes to sustain.
Exactly. But the Norse strategy was totally different. Their violence was opportunistic, highly strategic, and almost entirely focused on sea lanes and choke points. They were looking for the highest return on investment for their risk.
That venture capitalist analogy is incredibly accurate, down to the actual financial structures they used.
Really? How so?
Well, a Viking voyage was often a joint stock venture. Men would pool their resources to build a ship and supply it, and everyone got a proportional share of the profits, whether from trade or plunder, based on their investment of capital or labor.
Oh, wow.
It was efficiency applied to conflict and commerce.
So they didn't want to conquer the inland.
They understood that inland wars of attrition were a massive waste of energy and resources, especially when your home base in Scandinavia has a relatively small population.
Right, you can't replace the manpower.
Exactly. You can't afford to lose 10,000 men in a pitched battle over a muddy field. Instead, they used their unparalleled maritime technology the clinker-built longship.
What made the longship so special compared to what everyone else had?
It was a technological marvel. The overlapping oak planks made it incredibly flexible, allowing it to bend and ride over massive ocean swells without breaking.
So it could survive the open ocean.
Yes, yet it had a remarkably shallow draft. A ship carrying 40 armed men could navigate in water less than a meter deep.
Less than a meter.
Yes, this meant they could cross the brutal North Sea and then immediately sail straight up a shallow inland river right into the heart of a country.
Bypassing all the coastal defenses entirely.
They turned the geography of their enemies against them.
So they would strike a wealthy coastal monastery like Lindisfarne because it was unguarded, liquid wealth, high ROI, low risk.
Exactly. But they didn't just raid. When it made more economic sense, they established fortified trading posts. They secured toll routes on the Russian rivers.
Very strategic.
They even inserted themselves as the elite mercantile and military class in places like early Kyiv, essentially offering protection and trade logistics in exchange for tribute. They leveraged mobility to outmaneuver larger, slower agrarian empires.
It is a brilliant, if, utterly ruthless strategy. But it begs a massive question. If these guys were so heavily armed, so violently strategic, and so fiercely independent abroad, how did they manage their societies at home without just constantly tearing each other apart?
That's a fair question.
I mean, you'd think a society of armed, profit-seeking maritime mercenaries would be a recipe for absolute chaos and constant civil war in Scandinavia.
You would think so.
Yeah.
It looks like a paradox from the outside. But what held them together wasn't an oppressive king's army enforcing the peace.
Right.
It was an incredibly rigid, deeply respected legal culture. Alongside this outward-facing warrior culture, there was a profound procedural foundation based on negotiated dispute resolution.
The system of assemblies, right? The things.
Yes, the things.
Yeah.
T-H-I-N-G. These were local, regional, and eventually national assemblies where free men gathered at specific times of the year to negotiate laws, settle disputes, arrange marriages, and make major political decisions.
I read about the one in Iceland.
The Althing, yes. Established in 930 CE, it is often cited as one of the oldest surviving parliaments in the world.
So if I had a dispute with my neighbor over stolen sheep or, like, a blood feud, we didn't just hack each other to pieces.
Well, sometimes you did. But the culture strongly disincentivized endless blood feuds because they were destructive to the community's survival.
Okay, so what was the alternative?
Instead, you took the dispute to the thing. There, a law speaker, a man who had memorized the oral law code, would recite the precedents. The assembly would judge the case, and usually the penalty was financial.
Financial.
Yes, it was called weregild, or man price.
Yeah.
Even murder had a specific negotiated price attached to it based on the victim's social status. It was a way to restore balance without triggering a generational cycle of violence.
That is fascinating. So it wasn't a society of absolute despots just ruling by fear.
Not at all. Even as kingship began to emerge in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, those early kings didn't just sweep away the local elites and rule by divine right.
They couldn't.
Kings had to travel from thing to thing, seeking the approval and allegiance of the local chieftains and free farmers. The governance model was built on consensus, shared norms, and intense negotiation, not just top-down dictation.
There's a really beautiful sociological lens for understanding this mindset in the sources. It's often referred to as the Bannock reflection.
Ah, yes. Leading to the philosophy of lead under starlight.
Let's unpack that for a second because it gets to the very core of the Northern European psyche. So a bannock is a very simple, practical, unleavened flatbread.
Right.
It's the kind of food you cook on a hot stone over a fire in the middle of nowhere. It's not a decadent, multi-tiered wedding cake. It's strictly survival food.
Exactly.
The Bannock reflection is the sociological idea that power and community in the North operated like sharing that bread around a small fire in the freezing dark. Everyone gets a piece because everyone's survival is linked.
You don't hoard the bread.
Right. And you don't need someone standing on a golden throne shouting about how great the bread is. You just need someone to quietly and fairly distribute it.
And that leads to the lead under starlight philosophy.
Exactly. In a landscape defined by long, brutal winters, dangerous seas, and sparse populations navigating the literal polar night, you don't survive through loud, grandiose, flamboyant leadership.
It just doesn't work out there.
You survive through patient guidance, deep trust, and quiet resilience. You don't need a spectacle. You need a navigator who can reliably steer the ship by starlight without panicking.
It is the absolute antithesis of the Mediterranean imperial model. Think about it. In Rome or Egypt, Authority relied on monumental architecture, towering statues, visible displays of absolute luxury, and the cult of the emperor.
Right, the leader was a god.
In Northern Europe, authority had to continuously prove itself through usefulness. Sparse populations and risky climates heavily rewarded mutual aid and institutions that lowered uncertainty. We can call this a deep tendency toward pragmatic collectivism.
So what does this all mean for their day-to-day emotional lives? I mean, if they are practicing this pragmatic collectivism, were they basically just proto-bureaucrats?
How do you mean?
Like just quietly filing their legal disputes and rationing grain while surviving the winter? How did they actually relate to each other on a human level?
It's a great question, and it highlights an area where Northern European culture is often profoundly misunderstood, even today. From the outside, the emotional culture often appears reserved, quiet, distant, or even cold.
Like the stereotype of not talking to strangers on a bus?
Exactly. People don't small talk with strangers on the bus in Sweden or Finland. But internally, that reserve is actually a sign of respect for personal space, and the emotional core is built on deep loyalty and long-term reliability.
So it's not actually coldness.
No. Trust is not given freely or loudly, but once it is earned, it forms an unbreakable bedrock.
I love the metaphor sociologists use for this in the text. They contrast it with the Mediterranean emotional style, which they call fireworks.
Right. Bright, loud, expressive, immediate, and explosive.
But the northern emotional landscape is described as a steady fire in winter. It doesn't flash and dazzle you, it doesn't put on a show, but it keeps you alive through the longest, darkest nights.
It's a very evocative way to put it.
It is about connection that is earned slowly, tested by hardship, and runs incredibly deep.
And if we step back, we can see how that underlying emotional and organizational culture actually scales up over time.
Because it doesn't just stay local.
Right. You start with these local tribal assemblies, these things built on consensus, slow trust, and weregild. And as we move forward in history, we see this exact same quiet, steady organizational power transition from resolving local blood feuds to running massive international commercial networks.
Which brings us to the next massive shift in the region. The Viking Age eventually burns out.
Right. The easy targets get fortified.
Exactly. The climate shifts, and European kingdoms get much better at defending themselves. But that maritime frontier mentality doesn't vanish. It just changes its business model.
That's a good way to frame it.
The raiding chiefs are replaced by powerful merchants with ledger books and towns. We enter the era of the Hanseatic League.
The Hanseatic League is arguably the second great phase of this maritime logic. Operating primarily from the 13th to the 15th centuries, it wasn't a country.
What was it?
It was a vast commercial web, a confederation of merchant guilds and market towns that completely dominated trade across the North Sea and the Baltic. They didn't conquer territory in the traditional Roman sense, they conquered trade routes.
How did their ships and methods differ from the Vikings, though, if they were still maritime?
It was a huge shift from mobility and speed to volume and capitalization. The Vikings used the longship, fast, flexible, shallow. The Hanseatic merchants used the cog.
The cog.
Yes. The cog was a completely different beast. It had a deep draft, high sides, a single massive square sail, and a stern-mounted rudder. It wasn't built for rowing up shallow rivers to raid. It was built like a floating warehouse.
So they couldn't sneak up on anyone with it?
No, but it could carry massive, heavy bulk cargo.
So what were they moving in these floating warehouses?
They moved the fundamental commodities that kept medieval Europe functioning. They shipped millions of tons of salted herring and dried cod, which fed Catholic Europe during fasting days.
Oh, because of meat restrictions.
Exactly. They moved vast quantities of timber, furs, iron, copper, and beeswax from the northern forests down into continental Europe and brought back salt, wine, cloths, and spices.
And to manage all of that, they essentially had to invent new financial mechanics, right? I mean, you can't just barter millions of tons of cod.
Absolutely, because you are dealing with bulk goods over massive distances across multiple kingdoms with different currencies. Carrying chests of silver was too dangerous and inefficient.
Especially with pirates.
Right. So the Hanseatic merchants, centered in cities like Lubeck, utilized sophisticated credit systems, letters of credit, and complex accounting methods. They standardized weights and measures. They even negotiated tax exemptions from kings.
It is staggering. They basically built a multinational corporate monopoly, complete with its own private navy, that could dictate terms to actual monarchs.
They had immense power.
If a king in Norway or Denmark defied them or raised tolls, the Hanseatic League would just enact a massive trade embargo, starve the kingdom of grain, or hire privateers to destroy the king's ships until he submitted.
They completely bypassed the political centers entirely using the edges.
But while the Hanseatic League was busy getting rich, standardizing trade, and building these beautiful brick merchant houses in places like Bergen and Riga, there was another, much darker, deeply violent project happening simultaneously in the eastern part of the region.
Yes, and it's vital we cover this to keep the deep dive balanced.
We often have a soft focus myth that Northern Europe was always this enlightened, peaceful place. But the sources explicitly point out their history of minority suppression, slavery participation, and internal colonization.
Especially regarding the Sami and Baltic peoples.
Right. We have to talk about the Northern Crusades.
It is crucial to address this to maintain an accurate understanding. While the Hanseatic towns were mixing German, Scandinavian, Finnic, and Baltic elements in this seemingly cosmopolitan commercial web, the Eastern Baltic was experiencing centuries of relentless military subjugation.
What were the Northern Crusades exactly, for someone who hasn't heard of them?
Officially, they were sanctioned by the Pope as Christian missions to convert the remaining pagan populations of the Baltic.
So the Livonians, Estonians, Prussians, and Lithuanians.
Yes, but in reality, the Northern Crusades were a massive, brutal project of territorial expansion, wealth extraction, and political control. You had Danish kings, Swedish kings, Polish dukes, and most notably, heavily armed German military orders like the Teutonic Knights pushing violently into the Eastern Baltic.
And this wasn't just a peaceful spiritual awakening where priests handed out pamphlets.
Not at all. It was conquest by the sword. The Teutonic Knights built massive brick castles to lock down the territory. They engaged in scorched earth warfare against the indigenous Baltic pagans.
It's really dark.
It is. It resulted in forced mass conversions and the installation of entirely new, rigid social hierarchies. The local Baltic and Finnic peoples were stripped of their land rights and largely reduced to serfdom under an elite class of Baltic German nobility.
And we also need to explicitly mention that the economic machinery of this era still involved slavery. The capturing and selling of indigenous pagan captives was a reality during these crusading periods.
Echoing the earlier Viking thrall trade, yes.
It was a brutally extractive frontier.
It was. And this internal colonization wasn't just limited to the Baltic states. We also see the long-term marginalization of the Sámi people in the far north.
Right.
As the newly centralized Scandinavian states, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, began to expand their borders and look northward for taxable resources like furs, fish, and later iron and timber, they increasingly encroached on Sámi.
They essentially pushed the administrative state into the wilderness.
Exactly. They sent missionaries to aggressively stamp out Sámi shamanic practices. They disrupted the reindeer migration routes with new borders, and they heavily taxed the indigenous populations.
This raises an incredibly important question from the sources, one that is a recurring tension in Northern European history.
What's that?
The historical conflict between indigenous or local rights and state development.
Ah, yes.
As these early decentralized networks consolidated into powerful centralized states, they inevitably crushed or constrained the lifeways of minorities. There is a deep friction between the egalitarian, pragmatic collectivism the region is famous for and the cold, bureaucratic reality of state expansion and resource control.
And it's a tension that didn't just vanish in the Middle Ages. It persists even today. You see it in modern debates across Scandinavia over land use, green energy development, wind farms, iron mining, and Sámi grazing rights in the north.
It's an ongoing issue.
The state wants to optimize resources for the collective good, but that optimization often threatens the indigenous minority.
It's a complex, turbulent brew. You have the Hanseatic commercial monopolies inventing modern corporate logistics, the Teutonic Knights violently forging new social hierarchies, and the shifting of power from local chieftains at the Thing to centralized kings in capital cities.
Right.
But the text notes that all of this heavy, contradictory history laid the exact groundwork for the modern nations we recognize today.
It did. Because as we transition out of the medieval period and into the early modern and modern eras, the region passes through a series of massive overlapping empires.
Like the Swedish Empire.
Yes. The Baltic Sea became a lake contested by great powers.
Yeah.
You had the Swedish Empire, which for a time in the 17th century completely dominated the Baltic coast.
Wow.
You had the Danish-Norwegian Union controlling the entrance to the Baltic, and later, the aggressively expanding Russian Empire under Peter the Great and his successors.
The map was constantly being redrawn. Finland, for example, spent centuries as an integrated part of the Swedish realm before being conquered in 1809 and becoming an autonomous Grand Duchy under the Russian Empire.
Right.
They didn't gain full independence until 1917 during the chaos of the Russian Revolution.
And the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had an even more agonizingly complex path.
Oh, definitely.
They emerged from centuries of Baltic German and Russian imperial domination to briefly gain independence after World War I, only to suffer horrific occupation under both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, enduring decades of Soviet communist domination before finally restoring their independence in 1991.
But intertwined with all of this imperial shifting, this constant drawing and redrawing of borders, was the 19th century national awakening.
Yes, a very pivotal era.
And this is such a fascinating period because national identity in Northern Europe didn't just harden through military conquest, it hardened through deliberate cultural engineering.
The National Awakening was a profound intellectual and cultural movement. Because these populations had been subjects of various empires for so long, they essentially had to rediscover, or in some cases construct, their own distinct national identities to justify their push for sovereignty.
How did they do that, practically speaking?
Through language and folklore. Intellectuals traveled into the deep countryside to collect ancient oral poetry and myths.
Oh, right.
A perfect example is Elias Lönnrot in Finland, who compiled the Kalevala, the Finnish national epic, from Karelian runo singers. They standardized local languages, built national theaters, and used romantic painting and music to say, look at our distinct landscape and our ancient roots. We are a distinct people, not just a province of Sweden or Russia.
And while they were defining their cultural souls, they were also physically modernizing. But, true to the ancient maritime and geographic blueprint we've been tracking, their industrialization was highly tailored to their specific, challenging terrain.
They didn't just copy everyone else.
No, they didn't try to build identical generic European economies. They played the hands they were dealt by nature.
Exactly. You see intense geographic specialization. Sweden and Finland utilized their massive boreal forests and ancient bedrock to industrialize through timber, paper milling, and high-quality iron and steel engineering.
Leveraging what they had.
Norway, with its endless coastline, deep fjords, and massive mountains, couldn't farm on a massive scale. So they leaned heavily into becoming a global shipping superpower, developing massive commercial merchant fleets, harnessing hydropower, and later discovering offshore oil.
And Denmark.
Denmark, with its flatter, more forgiving southern terrain, modernized its agriculture into a highly efficient, cooperative dairy and pork export machine.
It's just brilliant adaptation. And this brings us to what I think is the most profound insight in this entire deep dive.
Let's hear it.
When we look at the modern Nordic welfare states today, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, we see these highly organized, high-trust, heavily structured, wealthy societies. And we tend to think of the welfare state as a purely modern 20th century political invention.
Right, like a bunch of mid-century politicians sitting in a room drafting tax policy.
Exactly. But the sociological research we have argues that this is actually a direct long-term evolution of their most ancient survival strategies.
It is a stunning through line. Let's think back to the geography from the beginning of our discussion.
Right.
When you live in an environment defined by incredibly harsh winters, extremely short growing seasons, and scarce resources, survival depends entirely on efficiency, storage, long-term planning, and intense mandatory cooperation.
You can't just go it alone.
No, you cannot survive a 6-month northern winter purely on rugged, selfish individualism. If you don't help your neighbor repair their roof or share the grain harvest, the community dies.
You absolutely need the collective.
Yes. Over centuries, that absolute necessity for winter storage and mutual aid evolved into parish grain banks, where farmers would deposit surplus grain to be loaned out during famine years.
Oh, wow.
And over time, those local parish mechanisms scaled up. The modern Nordic welfare state is essentially the optimized, highly institutionalized, bureaucratic version of that ancient civic infrastructure.
It's like they took the architecture of a winter survival shelter and used it to build a modern government.
That's a great way to look at it.
They upgraded their cultural operating system from survive the winter directly to optimize the society. The exact same cultural muscles required to ration grain, manage the village fire, and share firewood in a deadly winter were simply scaled up to create universal health care, free education, and progressive tax systems.
Exactly.
The bureaucracy is just a massive national stockpile. It's the steady fire in winter scaled to millions of people.
That is a perfect analogy. The state replaced the village grain bank, but the underlying psychological contract remained the same.
Right.
We all contribute so that none of us freeze.
Right.
But this highly optimized society contains a really fascinating modern contradiction highlighted in the text, one that political scientists study constantly.
Which is what?
It's the tension between extreme egalitarianism and hierarchy by expertise.
Right, because usually people who love equality hate bureaucrats telling them what to do. Northern Europeans highly prize egalitarianism. They value plainness, modesty, and fairness. There is even a cultural concept called the law of Jante, which essentially discourages individual boasting or thinking you are better than the collective.
Right, don't think you're special.
Yet, to run these incredibly complex welfare states, they rely heavily on powerful, highly trained technocratic bureaucracies. They rely on experts setting rules for almost every aspect of life. How do you balance a cultural demand for absolute equality with a system ruled by bureaucratic hierarchy?
They resolve it through the mechanism of trust, but a very specific kind of trust. They do not reject the hierarchy. Instead, they demand extreme transparency and absolute competence from it.
So they trust the experts, but verify.
Authority in Northern Europe is tolerated and even deeply trusted, but only as long as it remains publicly accountable and proves its practical usefulness.
Give me an example of that transparency from the text.
In countries like Sweden and Norway, tax records are entirely public.
Wait, really?
Yes. Anyone can look up what anyone else earns. The system is designed to be completely visible to the citizen. The moment the bureaucracy becomes self-serving, corrupt, or opaque, it loses its legitimacy instantly.
That goes right back to the lead under starlight and the Bannock reflection.
Exactly. The leader, or the tax agency, is only there to steer the ship safely and distribute the resources fairly. They are not to be worshipped, and they are not above the collective. Because of this radical transparency, citizens generally trust the state to handle their money and manage their societies.
That deep civic trust is the engine that allows them to function so smoothly at home. But the modern era, particularly right now, is forcing them to rapidly adapt to their external strategies.
The maritime frontier is shifting again.
Yes, we are seeing a massive, historic strategic realignment in real time. For a very long time, countries like Sweden and Finland were defined by their military non-alignment or neutrality, carefully balancing between the East and the West during the Cold War.
Yes. Finland's careful balancing act with the Soviet Union, sometimes referred to as Finlandization, was a pragmatic survival strategy for a small nation sharing a massive border with a superpower.
And Sweden hadn't fought a war in over 2 centuries.
Right. But with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the geopolitical environment fundamentally fractured.
And the response was immediate. Finland officially joined NATO in 2023, and Sweden followed suit, joining in 2024. It was a dizzying reversal of decades of foreign policy.
It marks a definitive break with older traditions of neutrality. But in a deeper historical sense, it is perfectly consistent with their ancient pattern of survival.
How so?
Remember the core thesis. This is a region that values connectivity, pragmatism, and strategic networks over isolated vulnerability. When the geopolitical weather became fundamentally unstable and dangerous, they didn't retreat into the frozen forest, they networked.
They found a bigger boat.
They integrated themselves into a larger, more powerful, collective security structure. It is the modern geopolitical equivalent of small, vulnerable maritime polities banding together in a mutual defense pact. It is the ultimate pragmatic calculation.
They are constantly, ruthlessly optimizing for survival. But here is an amazing irony, and it's something I really want you, the listener, to ponder as we start to bring this all together.
Okay.
While Northern Europe was busy over the last few centuries optimizing its own civic societies, surviving overlapping empires, and building these highly functioning welfare states, they accidentally ended up heavily programming the rest of the world's culture.
The sources really highlight this. The global cultural footprint of this relatively small population is truly outsized. If you look at the combined population of the Nordic countries, it's roughly 27 million people.
That is smaller than the population of Texas.
Yet their influence spans across almost every medium of modern global pop culture, design, and entertainment.
It's actually insane when you list it out. Let's start with mythology. Norse mythology has been completely repackaged and now dominates global entertainment.
Well, absolutely.
Marvel's Thor is a ubiquitous, multi-billion-dollar superhero icon, recognized by children globally, derived directly from a Germanic thunder god worshipped at those ancient things we talked about.
And then you move to music, which is arguably their most pervasive export.
ABBA, ABBA didn't just write catchy songs, they essentially engineered the mathematical template for modern global pop music.
Right.
And that wasn't a one-off. That legacy continues today. Swedish pop producers like Max Martin has spent the last 3 decades dominating the Billboard charts, writing and producing the biggest hits for everyone, from Britney Spears to The Weeknd to Taylor Swift. They cracked the code of global pop.
And if we look at cinema, you have the profound, heavy existential footprint of directors like the Swede Ingmar Bergman, who made Nordic cinema central to the exploration of faith, loneliness, and psychological complexity in the 20th century.
That's a huge legacy.
And more recently, the absolute explosion of Nordic noir, this entire recognizable, wildly popular global genre of bleak, freezing settings, socially critical crime stories, and deeply flawed, silent detectives exposing the bloody fractures beneath seemingly perfect quarterly welfare states.
Shows like The Bridge or books like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. So my question for you, the listener, is how does a region fundamentally defined by cold constraint, emotional reserve, pragmatic bureaucracy, and a tiny fraction of the global population end up producing the most universally catchy, bright pop music, the most dominant superhero myths, and the most gripping crime dramas on Earth? It seems completely counterintuitive.
It seems counterintuitive until you apply the maritime frontier lens we established at the very beginning of this deep dive.
Right.
This outsized cultural influence is the ultimate modern expression of that outward-facing network mentality. For thousands of years, they learned how to navigate outwards because they had to.
They were forced to look out.
They had to understand what the rest of the world wanted. Whether it was Byzantine silver in the 9th century, Hanseatic grain in the 14th century, high-grade steel in the 20th century, or a perfect, mathematically precise pop hook in the 21st century.
They are ultimate adapters.
Exactly. They learned how to translate their local styles and sensibilities into global languages. They are historical masters of turning geographical isolation into extreme cultural leverage.
Wow.
Think about why Nordic noir works so well globally. It works precisely because it plays on the universal tension between a high-trust, beautifully orderly exterior and the universal human darkness, violence, and chaos underneath. It exports their own societal anxieties in a highly consumable format.
And the pop music.
And ABBA works because it isn't just happy noise. It wraps a very northern, almost melancholic emotional core, often utilizing minor chords and themes of heartbreak, inside universally accessible, brilliant, upbeat pop melodies. It is all about connection, engineering, and export.
They didn't just build a merchant fleet for timber, they built a cultural merchant fleet. That is amazing.
It really is.
Well, we have covered an unbelievable amount of ground today. We've gone from the retreating ice sheets and the collision of ancient hunter-gatherers 9,000 years ago to the venture capitalist logic of the Viking longships, the corporate monopoly of the Hanseatic cogs, the dark moral landscape of the Crusades, the birth of the welfare state as a survival shelter, all the way to ABA and NATO expansion.
It is a massive, sweeping narrative. And if we synthesize the core thesis of all these historical layers, Northern Europe proves a profound sociological point that challenges a lot of our assumptions.
Which is?
That hard, unforgiving environments do not automatically make harsh, brutal, fractured societies. It is a common assumption, but in this case, it is wrong.
Right.
In this region, intense geographic constraint taught cooperation, long-term planning, and a deep, institutionalized respect for interdependence. A harsh, peripheral edge of the map became a globally networked center because the people there learned to balance steady, quiet resilience with incredible outward-facing flexibility.
And I think that is the biggest takeaway for you listening right now. Whether you are navigating an incredibly tricky, competitive career landscape, trying to build a resilient, high-functioning team at your company, or just trying to organize the chaos of your own life, the Northern European blueprint is a masterclass in systems thinking.
It definitely is.
It's about that pragmatic collectivism. It's the understanding that earning trust slowly but deeply, valuing extreme competence over flashy spectacle, and building robust systems that keep everyone afloat in the winter is ultimately more powerful and more enduring than just trying to conquer everything in your path. It's about being that steady fire in winter.
It is a highly successful model, but it does leave us with one final, deeply provocative implication to consider, something that scholars of the region are grappling with right now. For roughly 10,000 years, Northern Europe's ultimate superpower was its ability to turn its geographic isolation, its cold, and its harsh climate into a forcing function. Those physical constraints forced them to innovate, to cooperate, to build these high-trust systems, and to turn outward to the sea.
The constraints were the crucible that forged the culture.
Exactly. But today, we live in an era of hyperglobalization, instantaneous digital connection, and crucially, rapid, terrifying climate change.
Ah.
The literal ice is melting, the Arctic is opening up, and the metaphorical distance between Northern Europe and the rest of the world has completely vanished.
So the conditions are totally different now.
The fundamental geographic constraints that built their unique cultural DNA are being rapidly erased. So the profound question we have to ask is, as those ancient constraints disappear, will that unique steady fire in winter survive?
Wow.
Can the high-trust, pragmatic collectivism of the maritime frontier endure without the frontier itself? Or will it slowly melt away, losing its distinctiveness and assimilating entirely into the global melting pot?
That is a heavy, existential question to leave you with, a true paradox of success. But remember, the next time you hear a mathematically perfect pop song, or see a superhero wielding a hammer, or just marvel at a well-functioning, transparent bureaucracy, remember the frozen coastlines, the dark fjords, and the people who looked at the impossible edge of the world and decided to build a network instead of an empire.